A bronze disc, 30 centimeters across, heavier than it looks. The surface is a deep blue-green, the color of an old storm pressed into it in gold, a sun, a crescent moon, and a scatter of stars, one tight cluster of 7. For more than 3,000 years it lay buried on a hill in Germany. 2 men dug it up by accident and sold it for almost nothing. It is the oldest known picture of the cosmos. It begins in the summer of 1999 on a wooded hill called the Mittelberg near the town of Nebra in eastern Germany. 2 treasure hunters, Henry Westphal and Mario Renner, were sweeping the forest floor with a metal detector. They did not have a permit. In Germany, digging up the past like this is illegal. They were hoping for old coins, maybe scrap. Their detector screamed over one spot. Just below the surface they hit metal. As they pried it loose, their tool struck the largest object and chipped its edge, gouging the surface. They pulled out a heavy round disc, 2 bronze swords, 2 axes, a chisel, and a pair of spiral arm rings, a complete Bronze Age hoard buried together on purpose. They had no idea what the disc was. To them it was a dirty green plate with some gold on it. They wrapped up the whole find and carried it off the hill. What they were carrying would rewrite what we thought Bronze Age Europe could do. The very next day, they sold the entire hoard to a dealer. The price for everything, the disc and all the bronze, was around 31,000 Deutschmark. In today's money, very roughly 16,000 euros, for an object that is now considered one of the most important finds of the 20th century. Then it vanished into the black market. Over the next 2.5 years, the hoard changed hands again and again, passed between dealers and collectors who knew it was special but could not say exactly why. With each sale, the price climbed. At one point, it was being offered for close to 1 million marks. This is the strange engine of the antiquities trade. An object gets more valuable the more it is whispered about, even while the people handling it have no real idea what it is or where it came from. The disc was becoming famous and staying invisible at the same time. It needed someone who could recognize it, and someone willing to break the rules to get it back. That someone was Harold Meller, the state archaeologist for Saxony-Anhalt. By 2001, rumors of an extraordinary sky disc had reached him. He became convinced it was real and that it belonged to the public, not to a smuggler. So he set a trap. In February 2002, a meeting was arranged in a hotel in Basel, Switzerland. Meller would pose as a buyer's expert, there to inspect the disc and verify it before a sale. The sellers arrived. By Meller's own account, the man carrying the disc had it strapped to his body under his shirt, wrapped in a towel and tape. Meller examined it, and then he simply refused to hand it back. He slipped away, called the Swiss police, and the 2 dealers were arrested. The disc was safe, but there was still a problem. An object ripped out of the ground by looters has no record and no context. How could anyone prove it was genuine and not a clever fake? The answer was still in the ground, back on the hill. Caught and facing court, the original finders agreed to lead archaeologists back to the exact spot on the Mittelberg. They dug, and the hill confirmed the story. There was the pit. There were traces of bronze, and crucially the soil still clinging to the disc, and the swords matched the soil at the site. The find was real, and it was a true buried hoard. So now we can look at the object itself. It is a disc of bronze about 30 centimeters across and around 2 kilograms. Today it wears a dark blue-green skin of corrosion. Set into that surface, in hammered gold, are 3 things at first glance. A large round disc, which could be the sun or a full moon. A clear crescent, and 32 small gold dots, scattered like stars. It is plain, and it is strange, and it is beautiful. And it is, as far as anyone has ever found, the oldest concrete picture of the night sky made by human hands. Look closer at those gold dots, and one detail jumps out. 7 of them, sitting between the round disc and the crescent, form a tight little group to many researchers. That group is unmistakable. It is the Pleiades, the small clustered stars that countless ancient cultures watched and named. Be careful here. This is interpretation, not a caption the makers left behind. Some experts note the 7 dots are spaced a little too neatly to be a literal photograph of the cluster, but the reading is strong, and it is meaningful. Because the Pleiades were a calendar. Across the ancient world, farmers used that cluster as a clock for the year. When it vanished from the dawn sky in spring, it was time for one task. When it returned in autumn, time for another. A group of 7 stars set in gold beside the moon may be the oldest surviving piece of that farming sky. If that is what it is, then this is not just art. It is a tool for keeping time. There is a deeper idea here, and it is the most ambitious claim made about the disk. The problem every early calendar faces is that the moon and the sun do not agree. 12 lunar months come up about 11 days short of a solar year. Let that drift, and your seasons slide out of place. The fix is to add a 13th month every few years. But when? Some scholars argue the disk answers exactly that. The pairing of the Pleiades with a thin crescent moon, they say, is a rule. When the sky looks like this, add the leap month. Remarkably, a Babylonian text called Mule APN describes almost that same rule, but that text was written more than 900 years later and far away. So this connection is debated, and some specialists reject it outright. Hold it loosely. It may be that a Bronze Age people in Central Europe worked out how to keep the moon and the sun in step and wrote the rule in gold. Or it may be that we are reading too much into a beautiful object. Here is something the disk tells us for certain. It was not made all at once. It was rebuilt several times, over what may have been 2 centuries. We know this because the gold comes from different sources, added in stages. First came the night sky version, the round disk, the crescent, and the 32 stars. Then someone changed it. They added 2 curved gold strips along opposite edges of the rim. To make room, they shifted 1 star and covered 2 others. Those arcs each span about 82 degrees. And here's the intriguing part. From that hill, 82 degrees is roughly the angle along the horizon between where the sun rises and sets at midsummer and midwinter. Maybe the disk was being upgraded into a horizon marker. Maybe even that is debated and could be coincidence. Later still, a 3rd gold band was added at the bottom, and finally the rim was punched with holes, perhaps to fix it to something. A single object edited across generations. Now follow the metal because it carries its own story. Scientists have traced where the disk's materials came from. The copper in the bronze was mined in the eastern Alps, in what is now Austria, and the gold of that first night sky, after careful analysis, was matched to a river in Cornwall in southwest England. Think about what that means. A disk found in central Germany was made from copper, carried hundreds of kilometers from the Alps, and gold carried even further from the far western edge of Britain, around 3,500 years ago. Before writing had reached this part of Europe, materials were moving across an entire continent to come together on one object. This is the quiet revolution in the story. The people who made the Nebra disc were not isolated villagers stumbling in the dark. They sat inside a vast web of trade and contact. The disc is proof, in gold and bronze, that Bronze Age Europe was connected and ambitious and reaching outward. It is tempting to call the disc a star map. It is not, and the difference matters. Apart from that one cluster of 7, the gold dots do not match the real positions of stars in the sky. You could not navigate by this disc or find a constellation with it. One leading archaeologist has called it fairly a kind of imaginative picture of the heavens rather than a chart. So what is it? The honest answer is that it is a concrete depiction of the cosmos, a symbolic image. The sun or moon, the crescent, the stars, the cluster that marked the seasons, gathered into one sacred object. It was buried, in the end, as part of a ritual hoard, not left in an observatory. This is the discipline the disc demands. It is genuinely astonishing. But the moment we turn it into a precise scientific instrument or a perfect map, we leave the evidence behind. The real object is stranger and more human than that.
For all of this to mean anything, one thing has to hold. The age.
The disc is dated to around 1600 BCE, the early Bronze Age. That date does not come from the disc alone, which would be almost impossible to date by itself. It comes from the hoard it was buried with. The swords and axes can be dated by their style, organic traces in the find can be carbon dated, and the metals can be chemically fingerprinted. In 2020, two researchers, Rupert Gebhard and Rüdiger Krauss, challenged all of this. They argued the disc might be far younger, even Iron Age, and that it might not truly belong with the hoard at all. It set off a serious fight, and the challenge did not hold. Ernst Pernicka, Harold Meller and their colleagues answered it in detail. The copper in the disc matches the copper in the hoard swords, chemically tying them together as one find. The early Bronze Age date stood. That is how this is supposed to work. A spectacular claim, tested hard and left standing only if it survives. Whenever an ancient object is this sophisticated, someone reaches for the easy answer. Lost super-civilizations, visitors from elsewhere, resist it. There is nothing in the Nebra disc that needs an alien. Every part of it fits what we know about the Bronze Age. The bronze, the gold, the trade routes, the metalworking, the sky watching. It is the product of a skilled, connected, deeply human world. And that is the real headline. More than 1,000 years before the Greeks wrote down a word of astronomy, people in the cold forests of Central Europe were watching the moon and the stars closely enough to fix them in gold. They tracked the seasons, they may have wrestled with the gap between the moon and the sun, they reached across a continent for the right materials to do it. We tend to picture prehistoric Europe as empty and primitive. The disc says otherwise. It says someone up here was paying very close attention to the sky. So gather the whole strange journey of this object. It was made and remade over generations, out of gold from Britain and copper from the Alps. It was buried on a hill as a sacred offering. 3,500 years later, two men with a metal detector tore it out of the ground, chipped it with a spade and sold it for the price of a used car. It passed through the black market, was strapped to a smuggler's chest, and was finally cornered in a hotel room. And it turned out to be the oldest known picture of the cosmos. The mystery here was never aliens or magic. It is simpler and bigger than that. People we were taught to think of as primitive looked up at the same sky we do, understood enough to catch it in gold, and made something we almost lost forever. We did not lose it. It is in a museum in Halle, and it is still looking back at the sky.